Okay, so you've made your map and it looks beautiful, and what we're going to do with this map is, well, we're going to use it all semester, of course, like I said, but we're going to add the 3 missionary journeys of Paul to your map. So what I would do is either pick 3 different colors for each of the 3 journeys, or what you could do would be to do different marks, dashed, whatever you want to do. You just figure something out, and basically you just want to know which is the first, which is the second, and which is the third. Maybe you want to put a little key on there. So this is the first journey. We're going to start there, of course, and what we're going to be doing after we look at the 3 journeys is we're going to be watching a documentary on just kind of an overview of Paul's journeys, and it'll be nice to have a reference in front of us. So I'm going to kind of point out a couple different things. So what you want to do is maybe have a piece of paper nearby, and you can jot down just a couple of main things, because there will be a brief little quiz on this presentation, this PowerPoint, tomorrow. So just jot down a couple things. It will be no big deal. Don't sweat it. So let's start with the first journey. Remember that Paul was converted, and then about 9 or 10 years go by before he's really called to be a missionary journey. He makes tents in the city of Tarsus right here. That's where he was born. And basically Barnabas finds him and says, hey, you want to go on a journey with me? Called by Antioch right here. They're the calling church. And so that's God's call on Paul to be a missionary. And so he goes off with Barnabas, and the red here is the outbound right here. And the first place they go is Cyprus. And the video will talk about some of the things that go on the island of Cyprus. Basically, the first convert is there, a Roman governor. And after that, they head up here into basically the region of Galatia. This map doesn't have nice boundaries, but Galatia is right here. There's northern Galatia, and there's southern Galatia. His first journey takes him into some of the main cities of southern Galatia, and this is the group of people that he'll write a letter to later. So he actually hits up Italia, goes up here to Antioch of Pisidia, and over to Iconium, down to Lystra, Derbe. There's only one verse in the book of Acts that talks about Derbe, just that he had a positive experience there. And after Derbe, he's going to actually backtrack exactly where he was, but he's not going to go to Cyprus this time. He's going to head right to Antioch. The reason he backtracks after he's established churches is that he wants to establish office bearers. So he's going to establish office bearers in these main 4 churches, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, before he makes his way back to Antioch. And the purpose of going to Antioch is to give a report on what happened, because this is, there were Jews here, of course, and that's what the book of Acts talks about, but there were Gentiles, and that was the idea of sending him out. He was going to be preaching the gospel to not just Jews, but now to Gentiles, and that was the great commission of Jesus Christ before he ascended up into heaven. So he reports to the church at Antioch what's going on. This is what happened. This is some of the drama that took place. We got beat up in Lystra. It wasn't good. So all the stories that they got to tell when they got back to Antioch. But overall, it was a good report. Very good report. Gentiles were converted, and basically we've established churches there. So overall, this was a very good report. Now, what happens after that is that basically the Antioch church is overjoyed, but, go back here a second, some Jews come up from Jerusalem and ask about their work. And when Paul and Barnabas tell about the conversion of many Gentiles, the Jews are very upset. And these are the Jews that we talked about previously, this attitude that you had to do the Old Testament laws, and chiefly you had to be circumcised if you wanted to be a part of the church. So these guys were kind of negative. They didn't really care about the churches that were established. Their concern was, did you circumcise them? And Paul and Barnabas said, no, because that's not a requirement. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. Well, this was not something that the Jews were going to let go. They're very upset about it. And so what happened is they traveled south to Jerusalem. It's down here somewhere. It's off the map. It's right in this area. And basically this is the Council of Jerusalem, which we'll spend a lot of time with when we study the book of Galatians. But for now, they debated whether or not new converts had to be circumcised, and the decision of the council, led by James, was no, they don't. And this was a formal decision. It went out to all the churches, and this was a very important decision because that's going to allow, when Paul goes out into these other areas now, he's got this official decision that these converts do not have to do anything to be saved. Just believe in Jesus Christ. And the Jews don't like that at all, many of the Pharisee type of Jews. So what happens is, well, I should say the Judaizers. A little bit different than the Pharisees. Not the Pharisees, the Judaizers. They were a group that believed in faith, but they believed you had to do works. So this black right here is where they had to travel to Jerusalem to have the Council of Jerusalem. And that's in AD 50. The first missionary journey, I should have given the dates earlier, was 48, 49 AD. So the Jerusalem Council is 50 AD. So now they go out on the second missionary journey. But Paul doesn't have Barnabas anymore. Barnabas and Paul got into a very serious argument in Antioch over John Mark. This is at the end of Acts 15. They argue about him. Basically, Mark had deserted them on the first journey. He was the nephew of Barnabas. And obviously family's pretty strong, so Barnabas didn't want to let John Mark go. But Paul did not want to have him go with them. Paul and Barnabas argue so strongly that they separate without talking. And Barnabas and Mark actually go to Cyprus and revisit some of those churches. And Paul takes a man by the name of Silas with him on journey number 2. And he'll also have Silas with him on journey 3. But Paul and Silas go off, and they don't revisit Cyprus, but they go to Ephesus. Up here. The Jerusalem Council had made their decision, and they came back to Antioch to deliver that decision. This is where Paul and Barnabas argued. So they leave from Antioch, and they don't go to Cyprus again, but they go to Tarsus. They revisit the Galatian churches. The Spirit forbade Paul to go to Ephesus right here. Instead, they go north to Troas. This is where they pick up Luke. And Luke's the one writing Acts, and of course wrote the Gospel of Luke. And they pick up Luke, and they also have Timothy with them. And those 4 men do work in Philippi, and there's interesting events that go on there, meeting Lydia, getting jailed and flogged. Then they go to Thessalonica after that, and then to Berea. And then they travel down here to Athens, and this is where Paul's by himself, and he is on Mars Hill with the philosophers. You'll see that in the video tomorrow. And then he goes into Corinth by himself with some fear and trembling, because the city of Corinth was very wicked, very immoral, and he's there by himself for a little bit at least. He spends 1.5 years in Corinth. That was a very long time for Paul. At that point, after his time in Corinth was up, he travels across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus, only spends a couple months there, not very much time. And the reason for that is he wants to come back to get to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. That was important to Paul. He was Jewish. He did not teach that you had to celebrate the Passover. However, it was important to him. He never would have required that on anybody, but he wanted to go there as a Jew, celebrate the Passover. So he comes back to Jerusalem in around the year probably 52, 53 AD. And that completes journey number 2. So outbound from Antioch, there's no backtracking on this journey. He makes it here to Corinth, and that's where he makes his return back to Jerusalem. So this takes him into Macedonia, and in Philippi you have the first Christian church in Europe. And Lydia was, of course, the leader of that church at the beginning. The last journey takes place in the mid-50s, 55 to 57 AD, and after the Passover is over, Paul goes up to Antioch again reports on his work, and as was his what he did after the first journey. Leaves Antioch, and notice how it's very similar to journey number 3. You're going to have a lot of lines going on your map here, but he revisits the Galatian churches, and that means this is actually the 4th time he comes into the region of Galatia, because twice on the first journey, again on the second, and now on the third. This time, however, he does go to Ephesus. This stay in Ephesus is twice as long as he stayed in Corinth the first time. He's actually in Ephesus for 3 years, and it's in this time on the third journey that many other churches are established in Asia Minor. This entire part here is Asia Minor, and so we read in Acts that the word of the Lord went out not just in Ephesus, but in many different Asia Minor communities. Very powerful work of the Spirit there in Asia. Towards the end of the 3 years is when Paul experiences a riot in the great theater led by Demetrius. We'll talk about that later. And he has to flee Ephesus. And he travels north to Troas. And then notice how he goes into these Macedonian churches again, like Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. We're not really sure what is going on here. He may have gone further west. It's possible. But what we're going to do is we're going to have him going from Berea just down, to keep it simple, we're going to have him go down to Athens again, and then to Corinth. And then what happens here in Corinth is he basically is going to revisit the Corinthian church. There's a lot of history that takes place in the third journey, which we'll talk about later when we study 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But for now, we'll see that he's going to backtrack up here, and this is where he may have gone further west, but he's just going to hit these churches again. Instead of going right across the Aegean Sea, he's going to head over here, back to Philippi. But now notice how after Troas, he's traveling south and he goes to Miletus. He doesn't go to Ephesus. Why is that? Well, think of what happened at the end of that visit. He basically had a bad experience. And so he's not going to go to Ephesus again. Instead, he's going to meet the Miletus elders here. This is Acts chapter 20. And basically he has a very moving time of prayer and saying their goodbyes. And he sails from Miletus back again to take part in the Passover and heads here to Jerusalem. This trip right here was very difficult for Paul because he knew now that going back to Jerusalem would be dangerous. He'd done a lot of missionary work. The Jews were very hostile to these new churches and communities because they didn't like it that they were not being circumcised. And so Paul's actually going to have a lot of bad experiences here. He's actually going to be imprisoned. It will lead to some time before some of the Roman rulers, and then that will actually lead him to Rome later on. So that's where we'll stop it for now. Make sure you got those lines on your map nice and neat. We'll use those when we watch the video, and those are some of the highlights from the 3 missionary journeys.